Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to another episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
We have a few stories to go over this week that I found interesting. The first one I wanted to talk about is a small town called Arlington, Massachusetts, which is located about 6 miles from Boston, home to about 46,000 residents. So not a huge town, but one of the suburbs of Boston, revealed recently that it had lost over $445,000 in an email hack. So whenever I look at these types of news articles, I'm always interested in how the attacker got in. And in this one, the criminals pretended to be a legitimate vendor working on a high school building project, the Arlington High School building. And it was a major construction effort that started in 2020. And in September of 2023, the town employees received what looked like genuine emails from a vendor discussing payment issues. But at that time, the cyber criminals had already broken into some of the email accounts and they were watching their communication. So this is classic business email compromise, vector of attack. The emails were compromised, the accounts were compromised, and they were just doing some reconnaissance and looking and trying to see what's going on. And then they started sending some emails pretending to be that vendor, asking the town to change the payment method to an electronic transfer. So from October of 2023 to January 2024, Arlington unknowingly sent about 4 payments totaling up about $445,945 to the cyber criminals. The scam was discovered in February of 2024 when the real vendor reported not receiving the money. So the town immediately contacted law enforcement and their bank, and they started some investigations and they secured their email systems. The investigation showed that the hackers had tried to steal an additional $5 million, but those attempts were stopped. And fortunately, no sensitive information about the residents were compromised. The town's bank was able to recover a very small amount, $3,300. And in response to this attack, Arlington had taken several steps to improve the cybersecurity. All of the employees are undergoing mandatory cybersecurity training, and the town will be rolling out their advanced identity and access management measures like multi-factor authentication and implementing endpoint detection and response. So to me, I think this is where Adam and I have talked about many times, where the smaller companies, the smaller organizations are more susceptible to this type of attack because they may not have money to set aside for cybersecurity defenses, or they might think that they're not going to be a target. I think security through obscurity may be one of those things that they're banking on because it's a smaller attack. But understand that anytime you have funds, regardless of how much it is, I mean, this is not a ton of money for some organizations, but it could be for a small city like this, especially taxpayer money. And what it sounds like is they didn't have multi-factor enabled, and they probably had some weak passwords, and the email accounts were compromised, probably to just a email password spray or something to that effect. And they got a hold of some email accounts and so on and so forth and did some reconnaissance, and were able to get some money just from that. So I think in this day and age, no matter what organization you're with, my personal opinion is you got to have multi-factor auth. That's baseline for identity. You have to have some sort of secure email gateway, and you have to have EDR. Those 3 things I don't think are negotiable when it comes to any type of organization, no matter how small it is.
Agreed. And this is where the power of the default really comes in. One of the things, Andy and I both work for Microsoft, and we're in our security sales in the field. One of the things we've been doing at Microsoft now for a couple of years is something called security defaults in Microsoft Entra, our identity and access management platform. And the concept is, even if you don't own advanced licensing, even if you don't have anything configured, we will do a default configuration that is already secure, enforces multi-factor authentication, uses risk-based sign-in risk and user risk controls to protect accounts, and so on and so forth. And I think this is something we as an industry need to do even more of. More secure by design, secure by default configuration, where instead of failing open, we fail closed, and we have to carve out holes to open it up over time. Multi-factor authentication should be absolutely non-negotiable today, period. You just should not be able to have corporate, small business, small local, state and local government kind of account without it. It just shouldn't be possible. So this is a shame. Andy, one thing we've talked about on this show in the past and would be helpful here is also training folks who are involved in financial controls that when they get a request like this, there should be a standard process they always follow, and that should involve like voice or verbal authentication of the request. So you don't just get an email that says, oh, hey, can you send EFT over here for our monthly payment or wire transfer? You call them up and validate that that is indeed a legitimate request at a bare minimum, if not having some sort of other authentication, like they mail you something through the mail and you validate the postmark or whatever you decide would be appropriate. And then no matter how urgent it is, no matter what's on fire or who's dying or anything else, like we follow the process every time, because urgency is one of those hallmark telltale signs of a social engineering attack. We need this now. We need this yesterday. And when you have that process and you just say there's no exceptions to the process, that helps protect against this as well. So definitely cascading failures all the way down. Obviously significant dwell time as well for these attackers. They were in the environment for a long time. So I like the callback. It's something we talk about all the time on this show. And I think as we move forward, you're going to see more of this, where these, we talked about a multi-state auto dealership last week, but even auto dealerships are mostly like kind of independent businesses. And if they have a joint ownership group, I'm sure they're very lean and very light. And it's not really like an enterprise class organization in terms of how they operate. So these small and medium business, state and local government, I think are some of our biggest risk vectors moving forward.
I really like the call out for verifying the payments, because when I looked at this article and I just double checked, it is a 5-year construction project for this particular municipality. And so from 2020 to 2025, and the total amount of the project is $240 million.
Mm-hmm.
So if you factor in $240 million over 5 years, that's roughly about, let's say, $48 million per year. And this was over a few months, from looks like October through January. So about 4 months, $445,000, doing a little public math here, but let's say, that's like $50,000, $60,000 a month. So, over like a $50 million per year project, $60,000 a month is probably not that much money for a single vendor that like people are just cutting checks for. And then that's just one project, right? And so that type of money and that payment could be just overlooked if you're not doing that process that Adam had called out by verifying. You're thinking, oh, it's not that much money. This is a $240 million project. Like, okay, what's $50,000 to the vendor, right? No problem. This month, okay, we'll just pay it. And so that's the type of attitude that lackadaisical attitude may catch you off guard if you're just like changing the payment and it's not that big of a deal for the amount of money that you normally handle, and you just go ahead and send it. So even for a municipality that is not that big, this was a pretty big financial commitment for the residents and whoever else put in money for this project. So not overall, probably not going to be that big of a dent on the overall project, but it's still money lost. And for other organizations, that could be the nail in the coffin that puts them out of business.
Right.
Okay. The next story that I wanted to talk about, I had actually missed this. And when I was looking at some news articles, this one really caught my eye. So on June 20th, just a few days ago, the Biden administration announced an upcoming ban of Kaspersky antivirus software and pushing out any updates to U.S. companies and consumers. And the administration is giving customers until September 29th of this year, 2024, to find alternative security software. When I first read this, I thought for a second that it was just the federal government, because that's usually when you're talking about cybersecurity initiatives and all that, the federal government initiatives are usually just targeted to federal government agencies. When I read closer, this is actually to all U.S. companies and consumers, everyone in the U.S., any U.S.-based company and any resident and consumer based in the U.S. The order is coming from the Department of Commerce, a branch of it called the Bureau of Industry and Security. And they announced a final determination prohibiting Kaspersky Lab Incorporated, the U.S. subsidiary of the Russian-based antivirus software and cybersecurity company, from directly or indirectly providing AV software and cybersecurity products to anyone in the United States or U.S. persons. So they issued a bunch of reasons why, and also looked at some of the risk factors that were considered, the threats that were posed by the Russian Federation, vulnerabilities that are in Kaspersky's products, and the safety and consequence of Russia exploiting those vulnerabilities presented. And they found that there were significant risks to national security and to the security and safety of U.S. persons because Russia is a foreign adversary that continues to threaten the U.S. Kaspersky is subject to the jurisdiction and control or direction of the Russian government. Kaspersky software provides the Russian government access to U.S. customer information, and Kaspersky allows for the capability and opportunity to install malicious software and withhold critical updates. So the manipulation of that software, including in U.S. critical infrastructure, can cause significant risk of data theft, espionage, and system malfunction. So after 12 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time on September 29th, 2024, Kaspersky will be prohibited from providing any type of AV signature updates, code-based updates, anything associated with that to anyone within the U.S. So I thought that was really interesting because I don't really recall anything like this happening ever in modern times. I don't know if you can, Adam, but
I mean, the TikTok ban.
Besides the TikTok ban, right?
But this is interesting because I believe the TikTok ban was a law that went through Congress and Biden signed it. This is just an administrative action by a bureau I've never heard of. So markedly different, although some of the rationale is similar.
Right. And I know I've talked about this on the show like years back, I think. That this was always kind of something that a lot of security personnel considered with US-based companies or any companies that might consider Russian a foreign adversary. Kaspersky does have that ability. And of course, any AV software has deep hooks into the operating system, kernel level type monitoring. So easily you can insert a vulnerability and take advantage of it, or insert malicious code, and then you just pass it off as good code in the AV signature. So definitely a valid threat. I don't know if we've ever seen that out in the wild. I think it's more just this is a significant risk that you would be taking if you continue to use this software. So really interesting. If you're still using Kaspersky in any other way, just know that on September 29th of this year, it's no longer going to be allowed, and they're not even going to be allowed to update the signatures. So it's pretty much a dead software after that time.
This is wild. We were talking in the pre-show, and I had not caught this either. I know at one point in time, 10, 15 years ago, Kaspersky was pretty well regarded and pretty popular. And over time, its popularity has diminished, I think, with the rise of some of these boutique EDR shops like your Sentinel Ones and your CrowdStrikes of the world. But it's legitimate concern when you have an organization that runs inside a foreign country that we consider to be adversarial and operates their country in a way that it is not unusual for the government to make demands of organizations operating within it to perform behaviors that are friendly to the government. You have that overall risk. And that's what's happening here. I didn't know this was an enforcement mechanism that exists. I didn't know there was a way someone could wave a magic wand in Washington, D.C. and say, we won't have this software, allow this software to be sold in the United States anymore. That's interesting. And I think there's a broader discussion over that. Even if this is the right thing to do from a national security perspective, it has a chilling effect, I think, on free speech in a way. And that's, again, a conversation for another time, but it is interesting. And Andy, I think what you articulated is antivirus software has tremendous hooks into the operating system. It's a tremendous amount of power and a tremendous amount of purview over everything going on that machine. And when you can see that type of information across hundreds of thousands of machines, that's a very, very powerful control. And it's something we talk about frequently in our day jobs at Microsoft because our solutions are built into the operating system. You don't have to trust a separate vendor and grant them that level of access. And if that were to be used for malicious purposes, as we're discussing here, that is something to be concerned about. And you asked if we've ever really seen it before. I don't think in real life, but life imitating art, you call all the way back to The Net, the Sandra Bullock movie, 1995. The Praetorians had the back door in the firewall software and leveraged that to break into a whole bunch of systems. So it is a thing that at least Hollywood has presented to us 19 years ago in film. So it's something that's not that far-fetched, I think, anymore. So ultimately, I think we could have a big discussion on this. This, again, kind of surprised me and surprised you. And I wonder if that's common in our industry. This hasn't gotten on the radar of a lot of folks, but I think there's more discussion to be had here. But when you compare it to something like a TikTok, where maybe there's less overall risk, in terms of, sure, you can gather a lot of information on the tastes and likes and behaviors of people watching videos, and you can maybe even run an influence campaign through it, which is a tremendous amount of power, to be fair. It's not the same as having absolute visibility and control of everything that goes on with the machine, especially with the sandboxing on modern mobile operating systems, where an app like TikTok can't really see a lot going on outside of it. So when I put on my pure cybersecurity like risk hat, I see less cybersecurity risk with something like TikTok, but I understand the concerns of that being wielded as a propaganda tool to influence the citizenry of the United States over time. And I think that's where more of those concerns come from. But I see some parallels between those two, although, again, how we got to that point and the enforcement mechanisms have been wholly different.
Yeah, really interesting here. So maybe there'll be some more updates on this, but if you are someone who's still using Kaspersky, it's time to shop around for a new vendor.
Yeah. That's fair to say. That's the number one takeaway for our listeners. If you use Kaspersky, you're not using it for long.
And it's funny too, because you mentioned how they used to be kind of a pretty prevalent name in AV. I remember working at Best Buy, and we used to give that out for free. like with a purchase of a PC, you'd get Kaspersky AV, a choice. There was like,
right.
I can't remember the different vendors back then, but probably Trend Micro was one of the more legacy ones, and Kaspersky or something like that. And we just here's your AV of choice with Windows 7 or Windows 8, and and I remember selling it. And
I have a similar story. When I went to university, it was, I forget which worm it was, but there was one of the major worms in Windows XP had just made the rounds. And, you have a bunch of unmanaged devices all connected to an Ethernet network, and it went haywire at school, of course. And so they started enforcing this thing where you had to run this tool to scan and validate your patch, and we're up to date. And then it also enforced you to install an antivirus. And I believe at the time, they pushed Kaspersky, if I recall correctly, because I believe it was like free to education usage. Maybe I'm misremembering, but that feels right. And so here it was, not that long ago, where that was being actually pushed on people and said, you should use this. We recommend it. Your Iowa State University wants you to have this installed on your machine before you can access the network. So,
all right, the final story. And it just seems that when I went through the news, there's a ton of organizations that are still getting breached and data being lost. And one of the ones that struck my eye was Crown Equipment. They're one of the largest forklift manufacturers in the world, and they employ about almost 20,000 people, and they have 24 manufacturing plants in 14 locations worldwide. So they confirmed that they suffered a cyber attack earlier this month that shut down all of their IT systems. And with those being down, the employees have been unable to clock in their hours, access service manuals, and deliver machinery in some cases. And some of the reporting suggests that, with these hourly folks not being able to clock in, they were being asked to use vacation time and all of that, which is an HR nightmare. And then it came out later that the organization was going to possibly cover those hours or give them the ability to make them up in some way. And so costing money and labor, and certainly affecting employees at the locations. But whenever I look at these stories, I always wonder, what was the vector of attack, and how can we learn from this incident? And in this one, it was believed that the breach occurred after an employee fell for a social engineering attack that allowed a threat actor to install remote access software on their computer. So, what can we do about this particular vector of attack? And we've definitely talked about this, but what really flashed through my mind was Adam had mentioned that both he and I work for Microsoft. And Microsoft, especially for us in the field, we have a very liberal policy on what we can install on our computers. Almost anything. In fact, it was funny, earlier this week, Adam, you had asked about possibly installing a game on a managed machine. And I have a personal machine that's managed by Microsoft with Intune, and I have a few games installed on it because I take that on the road with me if I need to work. And then in my off time, I'll maybe play a game or so. And so we have very liberal process. But the one thing that we can't install is remote access software that is not of the company's way of doing things. So if I tried to install TeamViewer on a Intune managed machine, and that includes like my Mac is Intune managed. And in fact, I tried to install TeamViewer. I forgot. I tried to install it on there to help a friend out, and it was immediately blocked. I couldn't even go to the website. So the website itself is blocked. And there are not a whole lot of things that we are blocked from doing. It's really interesting. And so like to be just blocked from going to the site itself, if you're able to go to the site and get the file, it's blocked on install. Like you can't use it at all. So that is one of the things. And so of course, this should be one of your security measures. You probably have some approved way of remoting into your employees' machines, and ideally that method should be deployed along with your management type, whether it be SCCM or Intune or something like that. Whatever it is, you should be deploying that tool and it should already be on there. Like an employee shouldn't have to install anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so anytime that they need it, your IT department would use that. And everything else, any other common method, obviously you can't know every single remote access software, but there's a few common ones. Log me in,
Go to
Team
my
Viewer.
PC, yeah.
Right, exactly. And so there's a few. Like if you're not using them, you should just block them,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then admin rights. That one is a pretty big ask if you're already using workstations with administrative rights, local admin. But if most employees don't need it, you should just remove it. There are other tools like endpoint privilege management, which is part of the Intune suite, which can give specific access to elevate like a specific process that could help alleviate some of that admin rights removal. And then definitely training. We talked about training in the first story, but requiring some sort of callback that the process should be, oh, you're asking me to install something. Let me just get a verification. I'll call into the IT department and verify that this is the correct thing. So it should raise a red flag. You should be like, hey, IT's never going to call you to do this. Always do a video verification or something to that sort before installing something on the machine. So, social engineering is very difficult, but I definitely think recognizing the red flags and doing training is the bare minimum, and every organization can do that.
There is a rant here on late stage capitalism and a company shutting down their systems and their manufacturing lines and then asking their employees to burn their own vacation because they can't keep their production lines running is really gross and offensive, but I'll save that rant for another day. What I will say is saying, well, you can make up the time we couldn't operate, like, is still gross and still horrible. You effed up, you own it. That's not your employee's job to fix that for you. And if you want to talk about engendering trust or distrust, maybe is a better way to put it, healthy skepticism of a request. Well, if somebody messages you and tells you you need to install this right away, or else you're going to have to burn vacation time, well, you guys have already proven you're capable of threatening that to me. So yeah, I'm going to do whatever they tell me to do. You want me to install that? Sure, let me get right on it. I think there's a bigger story here. And again, this is not the podcast. This is not the platform to discuss it. But there does come back to, if you want your employees to have healthy skepticism on requests they get, you need to nurture an environment where healthy skepticism is allowed. If you require absolute compliance and you are going to crush your employees like a bug because you screwed up and couldn't keep your production lines running, it's not a great way to have them be skeptical of other requests they get. So I'll get off my soapbox on that. Andy, I think you made a really good point on blocking remote access software because, to your point, it's a relatively small scope of popular packages. Now, are you going to hit everything? No. But in a lot of things we do in cybersecurity, it's like that adage of, how do you outrun, insert animal here? And the answer is just don't be the slowest person. You don't actually have to outrun them. You just, while they're eating your friend, you can get a lead. And sometimes cybersecurity is like that, where if you are too expensive to try to break into for a lot of the base level attacks, they're just going to move on to somebody else who left the back door unlocked. If you're locked down harder than Fort Knox, it's like, forget it. They're not worth it. There's another company right over here that's doing something stupid and I can walk right into. And so if you start doing the minimum with some of these things, start blocking, like, again, Microsoft, very liberal endpoint management policy, but that's one thing they're super hardcore about. Thou shalt not install remote access software other than what's approved. everyone should aspire to that. Again, not that we have all the answers, but that's a really, again, simple, manageable thing to do that really reduces a lot of this risk. And so that's really it, right? You do keep training on social engineering and how to spot it and how to avoid it. And to be honest, with AI and deep fakes and voice cloning, that's going to get harder and harder to expect your people to figure out. So that's where you have to build tools and process and protection to protect against it. And the last thing I'll say on this note, and I'm not picking on an entire industry, but as somebody who used to cover a lot of manufacturing accounts, manufacturing is weird because it doesn't have a lot of regulatory compliance unless you're building stuff for the federal government or for the Department of Defense. And because of that, these organizations tend to have less compliance, less risk, less security type investment because they've just never had to. Nobody cares other than OSHA, pretty much, is your only really regulation you have to deal with. And I think that creates an environment that's very different than, say, healthcare or financial services, where they're very accustomed to having a high level of regulation, and security kind of goes hand in hand with that. It's not the same, but it's related in some ways in terms of the processes of being secure versus being compliant. So I think those organizations have a little more work to do to catch up. And in my view of the world and what I've seen, tend to be less mature. So, Andy, I think you nailed all the points. Just reiterate them. And it is interesting that ultimately both of these attacks we talked about tonight were social engineering in nature at the end of the day. And we don't know how the initial foothold happened in Arlington, Massachusetts. Probably phishing, most likely. Ask and somebody gave you your password and away you go. But it's an ongoing problem, and we have to continue to be vigilant against it. And it's not time to wave the white flag yet on our AI overlords defeating us in that case, but we should also be cognizant that it's going to be harder and harder over time. And so we are going to be expected to solve that with technology. And that means things like phish resistant authentication methods and things like that, where the human element can't override the protections that are inherent in the solution. For example, with a YubiKey or other type of hardware token, even if somebody calls me up and asks for it, short of me mailing it to them, I can't give them anything anyways. And that's the place we have to get to, where no matter how convincing the deepfake is or how good the voice clone is, there's nothing I can do anyways. And that's where we want to get to from a process, from a technology perspective.
I think one of the most important points that we kind of glossed over that you pointed out, but I'm going to just have some final thoughts on it, is this sense of how happy an employee is at a company, how the company treats the employee. Because in this case, like you said, it's kind of disgusting that they had a cyber attack and then they're expecting their hourly employees to take vacation because they can't clock in, they can't work, the whole system is down. And so there have been studies, insider risk studies that have shown that the happier the employee, the less risk you have against an employee turning on you, whether it be someone approaching them to let them into the physical building or giving them a password over the phone. Here, let me give you a, $1,000 check or something like that. And, off we go. Or just in your case, like, yeah, I need someone to install remote software. Otherwise, there's going to be consequences. Yeah, go ahead. Just do whatever you need to do, right? Instead of caring about what happens to the company because they care about the company because of how they've been treated in a good way, or in some cases in a bad way. And then they're just like, I don't care.
We talked about this on this show. I don't remember what episode, but I know we spent time talking about that aspect of cybersecurity. And we talked about partnering with human resources on that, because it is that critical to where unhappy, unsatisfied people create much more risk for the company from a security and compliance perspective. And that's something you want to avoid. And when you create an adversarial relationship, you increase the likelihood of it, whether that is rolling over to any social engineering attack, not being skeptical because the company operates with an iron fist, or whatever the case may be, you do enhance your risk from it. And this isn't saying, even in the like late stage capitalism sense of it, you could argue that this is better for business to have a better relationship with your people because it reduces your overall risk. And I cover a lot of the Berkshire Hathaway accounts now, and they had an internal CFO summit recently, and Warren Buffett spoke to all of them. And one of his key messages was you need to remove risk from your business wherever you can. And engendering that improved relationship, happy employees, actually has so many benefits from a pure capitalist perspective. And who better example of that than Warren Buffett? So it's something I think you definitely should consider. And one final thought on that, with the whole employee happiness thing, or using something for capitalist gain, look at Apple. Apple does a great job of talking about privacy and emphasizing privacy in their software and being privacy centric. And you could make one of two arguments. You could say Apple does that because it's the right thing to do and they believe in it in their hearts and their core. Maybe they do. However, you could also say there are literal capitalist benefits from it because it's a differentiator for Apple. It helps Apple sell compared to their competition, who is primary revenue stream is running an advertising service. And comparatively, Apple's primary revenue stream is selling hardware. And so they can differentiate themselves because they can. They know the competition can't go there because it's diametrically opposed to their business model. So whether Apple's doing it because it's the right thing or Apple's doing it because it makes more money kind of doesn't matter. It's beneficial to them. And so where I'm trying to go with this whole point from our perspective and our listeners who are cybersecurity professionals is this is where partnering and understanding where your employee satisfaction is at in your organization and trying to drive and improve that is helpful to you in your goal of securing your enterprise. It ultimately comes back to there are purely capitalist reasons to do that, but also it's still the right thing to do too. And so you can do the proverbial 2 birds with 1 stone here when you do that. So just kind of want to make that point and use Apple as that analogy.
Well, great show tonight. That's it for our podcast episode. All the links to the topics that we talked about will be in the show notes, as well as our contact information if you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.